I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before we begin this edition of the show, I want to remind you that I need your support to keep this show going. Please consider donating some cash to me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. On this edition of the show, we're going to be hearing from Jonathan Feingold, a Boston University law professor, about some worrying developments happening at Harvard. Harvard has recently dismissed 2 faculty. We're going to get into the story of their dismissal and what it means for free inquiry in academia. And yes, this does relate to a bigger picture issue of the Trump White House going after higher education. We've seen it with Columbia, now we're seeing it with Harvard. We'll get into it in the conversation to follow with Jonathan Feingold. Let's get right to it. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before we begin this edition of the show, I want to remind you that I need your support to keep this show going. Please consider donating some cash to me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. On this edition of the show, we're going to be hearing from Jonathan Feingold, a Boston University law professor, about some worrying developments happening at Harvard. Harvard has recently dismissed 2 faculty. We're going to get into the story of their dismissal and what it means for free inquiry in academia. And yes, this does relate to a bigger picture issue of the Trump White House going after higher education. We've seen it with Columbia, now we're seeing it with Harvard. We'll get into it in the conversation to follow with Jonathan Feingold. Let's get right to it. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very happy to be speaking with, although the story we're going to be covering is very concerning. Jonathan Feingold is a member of and representative of Concerned Jewish Faculty, and I received a press release from them recently concerning Harvard's dismissing of professors involved with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies leadership. Jonathan, could you take us through what are the basics of this story?
So the basics of the story, and this is, first reported, I think, on March 26th by Harvard student newspaper, and then I think the New York Times picked it up soon thereafter, is the interim dean of social sciences dismissed the faculty leaders of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, as you said. Professor Kafadar, who's a professor of Turkish studies and was the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and Professor Rosie Bsheer, who was a professor of history at Harvard and was the former associate director. And what precipitated 2 organizations writing a letter denouncing the dismissals, and so those organizations being Concerned Jewish Faculty and Staff Boston area and the Genocide and Holocaust Studies Crisis Network, is this these dismissals seem to follow a really concerning pattern of Harvard penalizing members of its own institution who are trying to engage in legitimate academic discourse surrounding Israel-Palestine, and in so doing, legitimizing the president's sort of broader weaponization of antisemitism to both divide our communities, target students, and really dismantle higher education as we know it. And so the concern was one, it seemed to be sort of a deeply unfounded attack on members of the Harvard community. And then Harvard, as opposed to in a responsible, sort of serious way, investigating any potential claims, seemed to just be sort of capitulating, whether it was to a group of alumni or the president, in a way that, we believe undermines the sort of basic mission of higher education and makes everyone less safe.
No, I think this is really important. I mean, I don't know if you can speak to this, but what kind of message do you think Harvard is sending here, intentionally or otherwise?
So I think that, there's a few messages that one can read into this, and this is all occurring against the backdrop of Harvard's president after the Trump administration sends a very sort of mafia style shakedown letter to Harvard, claiming that it is going to revoke, I think, somewhere in the range of $9 billion in federal funding based on the really tendentious claim that anti-Semitism is running unchecked at Harvard. You have Harvard's president, who, in ways that seem really similar to Columbia's leadership, just you know, affirming the narrative coming out of the White House that Trump administration's deeply inflated concerns about anti-Semitism are well grounded, and also linking those concerns, whether explicitly or otherwise, to the advocacy that we've seen at Harvard's campus and otherwise, that, like all advocacy, on the edges, there's going to be, speech that folks might find disagreeable, but at its core has been a sort of a fundamentally sort of peaceful effort to sort of speak out against Israel's, I think quite blatant human rights violations in Gaza, and university stakeholders, including students and faculty, making what I think is actually a pretty common sense demand for an institution, through the way in which it's like money gets circulated into the broader economy, not to be supporting killing. And so it is both this, what Harvard's leadership is doing, whether intentional or not, it seems to be sort of supporting this narrative that is two parts. A, that this problem of anti-Semitism is running unchecked and somehow sort of in ways that sort of transcends other forms of bigotry or discrimination on campus. And two, that it traces to pro-Palestinian advocacy. Because it would be something very different for Harvard's president to say, you know what, we do have an anti-Semitism problem in this country, and the source is the White House. Because, President Trump has surrounded himself with allies who are either sort of the leaders of white supremacist movements in the United States, are openly aligned with Germany's, sort of the modern incarnation of their Nazi party. You've got Musk doing his, like deeply problematic salutes. And so Harvard could take seriously anti-Semitism and make really clear that we know that the White House is coming after us in this way because it sees universities as a threat to its authoritarian agenda. And one thing that we also know is that part of what the White House is doing in leveraging this very bad faith narrative is trying to both divide our communities and using anti-Semitism as a justification to go after the Middle East Studies Center and ethnic studies centers, African American history, Asian American studies, and all of that is wholly inconsistent with what should be the core of our mission, which is to pursue truth and knowledge for the common good. Now, footnote, or maybe this isn't a footnote, but once you ask the question, what is the business that Harvard University is in? Because a very different way to approach this is to be like, there's a lot of very legitimate critiques of Harvard and other elite institutions that have done far more to entrench like the inequality that pervades the United States and to justify it and create the mechanisms to do it, than to actually be engaged in a sort of meaningful knowledge production enterprise that would enable us to navigate a moment in which the federal government is utilizing race and racism as a political weapon to take down opponents and to divide us.
In terms of this specific case, can you take my listeners through, the sort of, I would argue, and I think you would argue, very scant evidence that is being used to justify this, and why you believe that there's a sort of smear campaign going on here?
So I think that's a really important point to make, is that so to dismiss someone from a position should require, legally, arguably does require, depending on what the employment status is, substantiated evidence of misbehavior. And here, um, all the evidence that has come forward so far is that um, uh, um, there was a negative response to a couple events that the Middle East Studies, that the Center for Middle East Studies either sponsored or was sort of part of promoting earlier this year. One had to do with the war in Lebanon, and one that had to do with the targeting of children in Gaza. Now, whether or not one thinks like those are events that, they would want to have on a university campus, or they're concerned about what is said, it's hard to imagine sort of more inappropriate topics for a university to be engaging in on its campus. But it seems like, and again, from the limited evidence that's actually available, is that part of the sort of basis for these dismissals was that in part because of some groups who described those events as anti-Semitic, unclear why, and lacking balance. It's also not clear whether any of those complaints came from people who actually attended the events, which, again, like I don't know if there is a pattern to outside actors targeting universities with these sorts of complaints when they actually don't know anything about what an event is, but when they read a flyer and perceive it as somehow critical of Israel. So I was part of an event at BU that took place this past fall, in which the headline was essentially, how are universities supposed to engage October 7th? This was a year out. And we were hit with this massive smear campaign, which was describing the event as, platforming an anti-Semite. And I think because, one of the people who was headlining it, their scholarship is about sort of grassroots uprising in the Middle East. And they have a book that happens to use the word intifada in it. And so it's just to note that there is a recurring pattern of when a university or department tries to host an event that is not just wholly sympathetic to Israel as a nation state, it seems to be triggering a coordinated backlash campaign. We also saw, just as another example, if I can add in, so over at Northeastern, another school in Boston, they were supposed to host Rasagal, a scholar of sort of genocide, and that also was met with backlash. The event ultimately didn't go through. But sort of getting back to sort of our letter and the Center for Middle East Studies at Harvard. So there was some resistance to events that happened this year, but that there was also earlier this document produced by some group called the Harvard Jewish Alumni Alliance. I don't really know what this group is, but the document that they produced, as we say in our letter, it does read as a smear campaign that is designed to both discredit and silence speech critical of Israel. But sorry, you want to jump in?
No, I wanted to jump in. I wanted to talk about that Harvard Jewish Alumni Alliance document because I think one of the key points that your group has made is that this document is relying on testimonies from 42 Jewish students, which is about 6% of Harvard's Jewish population. It doesn't provide evidence of sanctionable behaviors. So I wanted you to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, and so I guess the first thing that I'll say as a university professor, whether it's 42 students, whether it's one student, I actually think it's important that universities care about their students. And so, if you have students who are articulating concerns, again, whether it's just a couple or whether it's a lot, universities should ask, well, why is that? What's causing this discomfort? Is there something we have to do? But that's very different than having some document in which there is this move being made from.
Well, there's very sweeping accusations being made in this document.
And so it's it is the report is claiming that there is sort of this systemic anti-Semitism problem at Harvard. And it's just irresponsible for a university to move from sort of to accept a claim like that, given that, like, if you look at what the document is identifying as problematic, when it comes to the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and including the former leaders, it includes their role in preparing a reading list that was meant to bring in a lot of different perspectives to facilitate a comprehensive understanding of conflict in the Middle East that included a Palestinian perspective. And it's so, like, if having a reading list that is centering Palestinian perspectives is causing some students at Harvard to somehow feel alienated, well, we should ask, why is that? Because if that's the case, then we should assume that, a reading list that is, centering an Israeli perspective, presumably would then, maybe would be alienating other students. That alienation in itself, does that suggest that we should not have the reading list? Certainly not. But it also, there's a danger, and I think Harvard's sort of actions here sort of amplify that risk of falling into this frame, whereas, like, you're either doing work that is going to be, comfortable for Jewish students or comfortable for Palestinian students. In part because what we've seen at Harvard and elsewhere is that many of the students and faculty who are leading sort of the advocacy to center Palestinian perspectives, to question whether universities should be investing in Israel, are Jewish students and faculty. And so it's also just a false binary to suggest that pro-Palestinian advocacy is somehow anti-Jewish, just simply because so many of the people doing that work are Jewish and connect that advocacy to their Jewish identity.
I maybe we can come back to that, but I think what's really important here is this is, to me, bigger than any debates people have about Israel and Palestine. This gets into the issue of free inquiry versus institutional censorship. How can universities ensure a genuine commitment to open dialogue and rigorous debate when there's this fear of, we'll have reputational damage if this person says something controversial, or maybe there's going to be a donor backlash? Well, if you're going to be that afraid of that, you can't have that kind of open dialogue that the university is supposed to be promoting. It's this is a very dangerous and risky moment, in my view.
I chuckle because it's actually hard to overstate how dangerous the moment is in. And if we wanted to, like, really back up, we would say we could ask a couple questions. One, why is the Trump administration that is openly authoritarian? I mean, the Trump administration sent a plane load of people to what is essentially a prison camp in El Salvador, who are not from El Salvador, and has admitted that that plane load included folks where there was no legal basis to arrest them, detain them, and ship them to a country that they have no association with. And the Trump administration is now telling courts, well, we messed up, oopsie. But that is, for anyone who is a scholar of fascist movements, sees this as part of a playbook where you're going to ratchet it up. And even the Trump administration recently, I think the press secretary, the person who gives the press conferences, whose name I can't remember, but they were like, oh, yes, President Trump is considering doing this with citizens as well. So you've got this open authoritarian movement in the federal government that is not disconnected from authoritarian fascist movements around the world, and they're going after universities. So why are they going after universities, and specifically the ability of universities to engage in free and open inquiry, as you said? One of the reasons is that for an authoritarian to actually gain the sort of control over society that they need, they can't have independent sites of knowledge production. They just can't have these independent institutions that are able to tell the truth. If that truth does not align with the administration's desired talking points. And so that helps to explain why higher education universities are one of the first targets of the Trump administration as it attempts to erode any sort of oppositional force in the country. But, a second thing is, just a couple years ago, just a couple years ago, we had this like palpable discourse in the United States of like concerns about the existential free speech threat on university campuses. Um, and you had places like Chicago, like Cornell, like elsewhere who were saying, like, we are 100% like committed to free and open inquiry, like feelings, maybe they matter a little bit, but like certainly not as much as like what we do here, which is like we force hard conversations, we bring people together. And now we have this moment in which, first Columbia, and now Harvard seem to be, failing to actually defend what is like a core of the institutional mission, which is free and open inquiry and critical free and open inquiry. And and we should not think that the attacks now that are targeting folks who engage in any sort of discourse that is critical of Israel will stop there. This is the tip of the spear that is meant to sort of open the door so that the Trump administration, whether it's through the threat of like revoking federal funding or otherwise, is able to essentially put its knee to to the neck of any institution that wants to cultivate spaces in which we're able to have the important conversations that we need to have now. And the last thing that I'll say on this line is we should also just be asking why it is that a place like Harvard, which is, which has an endowment that must dwarf a lot of like country GDPs in the world, why it's somehow, unable to resist. Why is it not, leveraging just a little bit of that endowment? Like even if some of it's restricted, certainly there's discretionary funds there where it could mount a campaign. But part of it's what you said. Like there's donors that these institutions are beholden to. These are very anti-democratic institutions that are run by a very small board of trustees where sort of faculty student input doesn't matter and where they're not actually situated to do, to serve the public interest, which, something that we should be asking is not just, how do we defend a higher education landscape that is actually worthy of a lot of critique, but how is this a moment in which we actually envision a positive sort of vision of higher education that likely requires democratizing these institutions?
Just two more questions here. And the first one, I only want this just because of limited time, a sort of brief response to.
Sure.
From your perspective, what role should Jewish faculty and campus organizations play in pushing back against the misuse of claims of anti-Semitism?
So I think it was Professor Nate Wolf, who was a Tufts professor, Jewish professor, who said this recently, and I'm sort of paraphrasing him, but I wholly support is that Jewish faculty, I think, should be on the front lines of both denouncing the Trump administration's deeply sort of dangerous, cynical weaponization of anti-Semitism, which is going to harm all of us, and standing by colleagues or students who are the target of smear campaigns. And something that's nice is you're beginning to see that. So you've had like over 3,200 Jewish higher ed workers and students around the country that are sort of denouncing Trump, and you have regional and local efforts doing that as well. My guess is over at Harvard, some of the folks who have been most vocal supporting the Center for Middle Eastern Studies are Jewish members of the campus. And like the reason why I think should be clear, and is that Jewish identity is being strategically utilized as a political weapon, both to target, DEI, just the institutional commitments to inclusion, to undermine all of the things that matter for higher education, like free and open inquiry, and in a way that is actually making Jews a scapegoat for everything the Trump administration is doing. And so, like, there's so many levels to the way in which the Trump administration's actions, it's not just weaponizing anti-Semitism, but it actually is anti-Semitism.
Very last thing I wanted to ask you. and I want to word this well, but what would a principled just response from Harvard have looked like in this situation? And what should be done now? What can Harvard do now?
So,
I know that's a difficult question, but
well, I'm not sure how difficult it is. Joseph Hawley, who's a Jewish professor at Columbia, who has been doing incredible work there, he wrote an op-ed recently, where in it, one thing that and I'm probably paraphrasing again, but he's like, well, what should university leaders say? Well, A, we're not going to be lectured on anti-Semitism by a White House that platforms white supremacists, segregationists, and neo-Nazis. And like that's actually easy to say, but to the extent a university president isn't going to do that, I think that it is important for a university president to name what's happening, and to name that what the Trump administration is doing is that it is weaponizing legitimate anxieties about anti-Semitism to undermine university independence, to divide our communities, because that is part of what's happening. The Trump administration is trying to divide us internally so that we're fighting with each other instead of unifying against an attack on all of us. To sort of further a broader attack on democracy, and that, of course, Harvard takes anti-Semitism seriously, but no more seriously than other forms of bigotry, whether it's Islamophobia, whether it's anti-Black racism, whether it's LGBTQ bigotry, see that to make clear that the sort of pro-Palestinian advocacy happening on this campus, the criticism of the state of Israel and its policies happening on this campus, like they might be, divisive, but they are not presumptively anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. And it is really critical as an institution of higher education that we decouple those two things: criticism of a nation state on the one hand, and some sort of hate or criticism of a people on the other, and to suggest that we, as like Harvard, we are going to form a coalition with all of the universities in this country to collectively defend against the Trump administration, because what we know is that if we're just invested in some individualistic self-preservation, the administration is going to pick us off one by one. And so in the same way that students and higher ed workers are engaged in coalitional work, we as universities have to as well. And as the institution with the largest endowment, we are going to take the lead and be the backstop for the smaller schools that do not have the resources that we have.
I know you have to keep going, but how can my listeners support the work that concerned Jewish faculty and staff are doing, and also, of course, the Genocide and Holocaust Studies Crisis Network?
Oh man, I wish we were a 501c3 and I could say send us your cash. But I think I don't. Man, I gotta have a better answer for that. I think one is to do what you can to support the students and the higher ed workers on the front lines, who are not just sort of the attack of this, but trying to build institutions that serve everyone. Because our institutions don't. And a lot of the critiques of these elite universities are quite valid. So we should figure out how collectively we can build something better for everyone.
Thank you so much, Jonathan Feingold.
Thank you.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.